On November 10, 2026, a set of export controls that Beijing suspended, not canceled, suspended, comes back online. The magnets inside every graphics accelerator NVIDIA ships, the substrates inside every wafer Taiwan semiconductor fabs, the phosphors inside every display panel, all of them run through a handful of Chinese processing facilities that have had, until that date, a temporary green light. The pressure point did not come from the sanctions, it came from the suspension, the pause that let every buyer assume the problem was solved. Trace the chain from the 2023 gallium and germanium controls through the 2024 expansion to heavy rare earths, through the suspension negotiation, to the facilities that were never actually replaced, and to the stockpiles that are already being drawn down. The suspension of China's rare earth export controls was not a reprieve. It was the mechanism by which the dependency deepened, because every quarter the pause held was a quarter. No Western buyer commissioned an alternative refinery. Start at the origin. In October 2022, the United States Commerce Department issued advanced chip export rules that cut China off from leading-edge logic chips and from the equipment needed to manufacture them. That is confirmed. What followed inside Beijing was a policy review, also confirmed, of what leverage China held over materials the chip industry cannot source elsewhere at scale. The review landed on three candidates: gallium, germanium, and the heavy rare earth elements used in permanent magnets and phosphors. The logic was straightforward. If the United States was going to use export controls as industrial policy, China would audit its own hand. The first move came in July 2023. China's Ministry of Commerce formally announced export licensing requirements for gallium and germanium, citing national security. The announcement triggered immediate alarm in semiconductor supply chains, and rightly so. Gallium and germanium feed into the compound semiconductors used in radio frequency components, power electronics, and specialty devices, but the alarm focused on the wrong choke point. Gallium and germanium are critical. They are not the deepest vulnerability. That title belongs to dysprosium and terbium, two heavy rare earth elements that go into the permanent magnets driving chip fab motors, electric vehicle powertrains, hard drive actuators, and industrial robots. China processes the bulk of the world's heavy rare earth supply, even when the ore originates elsewhere. The Jiangxi province refining pipeline, where the separation of these elements is concentrated, is not one node in a network. It is, for practical purposes, the network. Beijing did not stop at gallium and germanium. Through late 2023 and into 2024, the Ministry of Commerce and the State Administration for Market Regulation issued successive notices expanding dual-use and critical minerals licensing to cover a broader set of rare earth-related technologies and processing methods. Confirmed. Not just raw ore, but refined oxides and, critically, the technical knowledge for separation itself. The expansion made the Jiangxi pipeline a named choke point in regulatory language, not just in analyst models. When the United States Geological Survey, the International Energy Agency, and the assessments underpinning the European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act all converge on the same processing dominance figure, the dependency is not contested. What was still being negotiated quietly was how long it would hold before it became a crisis. Western governments read the escalating controls as a bargaining signal. That reading was reported widely and appears consistent with what happened next. Rather than immediately treating the controls as permanent and mobilizing emergency industrial policy, the United States, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea pursued diplomatic channels to negotiate a pause. The specific terms of that negotiation have not been publicly released in full. What has been reported by Reuters, Nikkei Asia, and Bloomberg, citing government and industry officials, is that a suspension period was agreed, holding the most disruptive controls in abeyance, with an endpoint reported to fall in late 2026. November 10th is the date that has circulated in those reports. Treat the date as reported, not confirmed. Treat the suspension itself as confirmed by market behavior, because buyers responded immediately and rationally. They ran down the clock. Here is where the chain turns. The link that carries the most weight in this sequence is not the original 2023 gallium and germanium controls. Those were covered heavily and did trigger a real diversification response. Government funding announcements, feasibility studies, mining exploration licenses in Australia and Canada and Greenland, political commitments to build Western processing capacity. The link that actually matters is the suspension, which arrived before that diversification response produced a single operating refinery outside China. The suspension did not interrupt the dependency. It interrupted the urgency to fix it. That is not an inference. That is the documented commercial logic of every company that quietly extended its Chinese supply contracts during the pause rather than paying the premium to qualify an alternative source that did not yet exist. The reason no alternative heavy rare earth refinery came online during the pause is not inertia or incompetence, it is project timelines. Confirmed industry data places the permitting to production cycle for a greenfield rare earth separation plant at roughly 7 to 10 years in Western jurisdictions, accounting for environmental review, community consultation, financing, construction, and commissioning. The suspension lasted roughly 18 months. The math was never close. No project that broke ground when the suspension began would be producing separated dysprosium oxide by November 2026. Not one. That is a structural observation, not a judgment about effort or intent. So buyers did what buyers do when a shortage is visible but not yet present. They built inventory. Through 2024 and into 2025, reported industry data, drawn primarily from trade flow analysis and pricing signals tracked by analysts including Adamas Intelligence and covered by the Financial Times, shows a stockpile build in processed rare earth oxides. Companies bought buffer. They filled the tower. Think of the stockpile as a water tower, not a reservoir. A water tower buys time when the main line goes down. It does not replace the main line, and the moment you start drawing from it, the clock starts. Every unit you pull out is a unit closer to zero. The drawdown reportedly began accelerating in 2025. The suspension was still holding, but procurement teams were consuming buffer rather than rationing it because rationing has a cost too. It means telling downstream customers to expect delays, which means losing orders. So the buffer thinned. By the time November 10, 2026 approaches, the inventory position across the supply chain is, by analyst estimates, measurably thinner than it was at the suspension's start. The specific numbers are company proprietary and not publicly confirmed with precision. Treat the direction as reported. Treat the magnitude as estimated. The Jiangxi pipeline, introduced at the start of this chain as the physical infrastructure behind every permanent magnet in every graphics accelerator NVIDIA ships, now reappears not as a distant policy concern, but as a countdown. The facilities were never replaced, the processing knowledge was never transferred, the alternative refineries were never built. The buyers drew down the stockpile that was supposed to buy the time to build them. And now the inversion. Every conversation about rare earth risk in the chip industry circles back to the same names: NVIDIA, Taiwan Semiconductor, the major fabless designers, the leading logic foundries. Those are the companies the coverage is about. The stress did not first appear at the chip fab, where everyone was watching. It appeared at the magnet supplier one tier above, the company nobody was writing about. This is inferred, but it rests on a structural logic that is consistent with every reported procurement chain. Permanent magnet manufacturers have shorter procurement cycles than semiconductor fabs. Their buffer was consumed first. When dysprosium and terbium flow tightens, the lead time extension shows up at the Tier 1 magnet and motor suppliers before it shows up at the wafer fab. Chip fab disruption, if it comes, arrives 1 or 2 procurement cycles behind. The entity at the center of every chip supply article is not the entity that moves first. Watch for that signal, because it is the early indicator the structural model predicts. The chain's softest point is the November 10th date itself. The suspension terms have been reported but not officially released, and the exact reinstatement conditions may include automatic renewal clauses or graduated reentry provisions that would blunt the cliff effect. If the date is softer than reported, the urgency compresses. The cliff could be a slope. Separately, the stockpile drawdown data is analyst estimated from trade flows and pricing signals, not from disclosed corporate inventory figures. If major buyers were quieter about building buffer than the trade data suggests, the actual inventory position may be thicker than this chain assumes, and the inference that magnet suppliers move before chip fabs rests on a procurement cycle model that is logical but has not been confirmed by any disclosed supply disruption. It is a structural prediction, not a documented sequence. What is consistent across independent reporting is the direction of every link. What is not nailed down is the speed. The chain runs like this. A United States export control triggers a Chinese material supply response. The response triggers a diplomatic pause. The pause triggers rational stockpiling. The stockpiling triggers the drawdown of the only buffer that existed. The buffer runs thinner every quarter while no alternative refinery opens. The move designed to buy time became the mechanism that consumed it. That is the inversion this story is built on. The suspension did not sever the dependency. The suspension is why the dependency is deeper on November 10, 2026 than it was on the day the pause began. The Jiangxi pipeline either flows or it does not. No diplomatic agreement announced during the pause changed that physical fact because no agreement came with a new separation plan attached. The controls were suspended. The supply chain was not. Watch for one signal in the next 2 quarters. Whether permanent magnet lead times from Tier 1 suppliers extend past their historical range. If they do, the chain ran exactly as described here. If they hold flat, either the buffer was thicker than reported, or a carve-out was quietly negotiated, and this story has a different second chapter. If you want to track where that signal lands before the deadline, subscribe and turn on notifications. That is the next link.